Okay, we are live here on YouTube now with my friends Hunger the Die Merchant, Raging Manjul, and of course Furious Pertinax. Glad to have you back. And for this 1000th day, or 1001st day, I think it is at this point, we will be covering the Ukraine war yet again in our updates. So I'm sure most of the viewers are familiar with how we do things here at this point. So yes, welcome, Raging Manjul. Do you have anything to shill?
Yes, actually, speaking of warfare, you can go check out my take on how the Third Reich could have won on Substack. I have articles recently out on the OGC's Substack as well. So do check out all of that stuff.
Hunger?
Yeah, you can just follow me at Twitter at HungerDie, DYE. No content to shill. Just go on the Old Glory Club, find a local chapter, and yeah, get involved.
Yes, do that. And Marcus.
Yes, glad to see you guys doing well. OGC, by the way, that's actually quite excellent. As for me personally, just if you fancy following my shenanigans, at Furious underscore Pertinax. Oh, sorry, no underscore, just at Furious Pertinax at X slash formerly Twitter. And there's been a little spate of activity on Apostolic Majesty's channel. We last week we covered Charles XII and the Great Northern War, and in a couple of days' time we shall be covering the dissolution of Prussia. So if you're around and those things interest you, speaking of warfare, do catch those if you're able.
Excellent. And I will also shill the Old Glory Club. Let's see. I will share our website. So if you go to the oldgloryclub.com, you can read about the Old Glory Club, which I'm a founding member of. It is a mutual aid society, a fraternity among heritage American brothers. And this is actually where I do most of my content now, especially live streaming. You can see our YouTube link. We have the Pony Express Radio, which is a weekly show that I am often one of the hosts on. You can follow us on Twitter. You can email us if you're interested in creating a chapter. You can follow our Substack, where we have many articles by many guests. You can even submit your own articles to us by emailing us, as it elucidates here on the website, theoldgloryclub.com. You can also click the chapters tab and see if there's a chapter nearby you. And if not, you can always email us to learn how you can become a founder of said chapter. So yeah, if you're interested in following more of my stuff, obviously I'm not as active on my own channel anymore, and that's because I am doing this. So with that out of the way, other big thing we have to talk about is the cigar bet. So we made our own little cigar bet. Hunger the Die Merchant kind of initiated it. If people are familiar with Academic Agent and R.N. McIntyre's cigar bet, we sort of have our own little one just for fun. And yeah, so basically it comes down to this. Hunger predicted that by election day this year, which was 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think 2 weeks ago, there would have been both a big arrow, quote unquote, offensive in both the Zaporozhye and Kharkov oblasts. That has certainly not happened.
Partially, but I concede. I concede.
Yeah, I mean that's an L. But Raging Mandrill proposed that there would be a big arrow offensive in the Donetsk Oblast, probably towards Pokrovsk, which more or less has happened. My position, however, is that there would be no big arrow offensives this year. I think it's a little up in the air whether or not what's been happening in the Donetsk Oblast counts as a big arrow offensive. So we will be deciding that this stream, and perhaps as a neutral arbiter, Marcus can help us with that. And also, I might put a poll in the chat if I can figure out how to do that. But if you have any commentary on in the live chat on whether or not a big arrow offensive occurred in the Donetsk Oblast, feel free to comment, because I'm honestly not sure who has won this bet between me and Mandrel. So before we go looking at the map, which, as is custom, I will comment on some recent news, and then I'll let you guys give your takes in turn. So we have recent news. A few days ago, Joe Biden finally authorized the use of American-made long-range missiles uh, in Russia. So Ukraine may now use American long-range missiles to strike not the former territory of Ukraine, but the Russian Federation itself. Great Britain followed suit, and the Russian Federation has updated its nuclear doctrine and basically stated that any attack on its territory through weapons supplied by proxy parties to another will count as aggression from those powers or their allies in their own right. So basically, Ukraine firing American made and given, donated missiles into the Russian Federation counts not only as the United States attacking Russia, but also all of NATO as attacking Russia. And there's been some probable retaliation for this in cutting some undersea internet cables connecting to Lithuania. Now, my take on what this means, why this is being done. Some people are talking about, World War III, whatever. There was an article on the New York Times. Actually, I forgot to bring this up. I will grab it from Raging Mantrel's DM to me on. Yeah, I will pull up this article right now, actually, and share it so you can see on the screen. And we won't go through it, but basically, the New York Times has admitted in this article that the Ukraine war is lost. They also identify that it is a proxy war explicitly. So they're acknowledging, what everyone has known from the beginning. And what we've said is that it's a proxy war. And they're actually basically taking the pro-peace side. So, of course, all of the media has been very much on the help Ukraine as much as we can. We have to defeat Russia. As soon as Trump wins the election, they're now flipping to the pro-peace side. And then Joe Biden is authorizing long-range missile strikes. So what do I think is going on here? The way I see it is the media is now going to take a position outflanking Trump on peace. So the media is going to be even more pro-peace than Trump is, but only as a pretense. Trump will be sabotaged as they've sabotaged peace very early on in the war, more than 2 years ago, in order to make Trump a failure. So Joe Biden authorizing the use of these long-range missiles is part of the strategy, I believe, of setting up Trump for failure and stopping him from bringing this war to a close in 2025, while the media pretends like actually we really want peace. Trump is not delivering peace, therefore we can criticize him from this angle. So that's my take on what's going on here. It's not. It really has nothing to do with Russia's reaction. It has nothing to do with starting World War III. It all has to do with undermining Trump's agenda. So, with that said, I will pass it to Marcus first, and feel free to take this anywhere you like. What is your take on the long-range missile authorization and my interpretation of what it means?
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree, by and large. I think the disparity between the actions of, shall we call it, the Pentagon, U.S. State Department, the vested interest in Washington, and the media has subtext, and I think you've outlined it quite well. We won't really quite know how this plays out really until 2025 and throughout next year. But I do think that it is sort of a mechanism by which, at the very least, it's to frustrate Trump, throw a spoke in the wheels of a peace process, or as Trump would call it, doing a deal. Because on one hand, there is a technical and an actual escalation that's occurring, along the front lines and within the general combat area of this war. Meanwhile, there's a change in tact on the media side of, for what, 2 years essentially, they've been breathlessly sort of pro-war, stoking the sentiment of war, doing their utmost to create a a very hostile atmosphere about events here in Donbass, and to corral people into a certain perspective about it. That is being completely coin flipped. And like you're saying, you said it quite nicely, there are blatant admissions that are occurring now. Admission that it's a proxy war, admission they want peace, and admissions that essentially there is no route to victory, no path to victory that Ukraine can undertake, and very little in the way of victory conditions that they'll be able to achieve. Meanwhile, a government is coming into power in Washington that is, at least on the face of it, willing to treat with the Russians and achieve peace. So it is something we have to keep in mind of. That's for sure. The other thing is that and this is a subject that all of us have discussed and ad nauseum, is that there is the reality now that NATO sort of arsenals and stocks of weapon systems, of ammunition, war material, generally speaking, has been not quite exhausted, but people are really scraping the barrel now. Particularly the continental European nations, Germany and actually I think Poland's probably not quite there, but Germany, the Nordic countries, even to some degree, I've read some interesting reports about the kind of equipment Australia sent. I mean, Australia's obviously not NATO, but they're sort of a NATO-aligned country. They're sort of part of that coalition, the willing, so to speak. Our arsenals have been sort of stripped bare, and so there's this sort of reality, coming home to roost now, that there's nothing more to send to Ukraine. And then inverse to that position, there's the reality that the men who are filling Ukrainian uniforms are either sort of 40-year-old men or 17-year-old conscripts. Their best officers and their best soldiers, for the most part, with the exception of some elite units that are still functioning in the Ukrainian armed forces, are strewn across the various battlefields of Donbass, and as is much of their equipment. And there's, it's a pretty horrific situation for Ukraine as it stands. So I think on those areas, you've more or less touched on it. So I'll pass it over to Mandrill and Merchant and see where they go with it.
All right, Hunger, your take. And actually, before you start talking, I just noticed this article is actually updated to reflect the long-range missile authorization. So I'm going to scroll through it while you talk and see if I can find what was changed in here.
Yeah, no problem. Just to address the whole approval of missile strikes on Russia, I have a hard time believing this is actually the case, because first of all, I genuinely believe this is I don't believe this has happened. I don't believe Biden has actually officially given his approval, because there's no statement on Twitter. There's no public statements. Blinken hasn't come out and said anything. There has been no statement from the government that I have seen personally that has confirmed that this is the case. This is just one New York Times article saying that it's happened, and everyone on social media and everyone in the commentariat sphere jumping on this, taking it as a given that Biden has approved these strikes. Whether Biden has approved these strikes or not, the Ukrainians have been striking deep inside Russian territory. Just right after this article was published, literally within hours, the Ukrainians struck, I believe, Berdyansk Oblast, and targeted an ammunitions depot about 115 kilometers inside of Russia. And Berdyansk is an oblast that's neighboring Kursk in western Russia. So this is not a territory that the Ukrainians are actively fighting in, unlike Kursk, but still significant. I take the view that this is a psyop, either from the Ukrainians or from elements in the deep state, and that it has nothing to do with Joe Biden, or his, because we know what Joe Biden's doing. Joe Biden's on a beach in Delaware right now, or supposedly. But
is this to say that Victoria Nuland's still cooking? Like the State Department.
Victoria Nuland's been fired. I mean, Victoria Nuland has not been in.
Oh no, no,
Been in
I know.
charge.
I was speaking like proverbially speaking, but yeah.
Oh yeah, definitely. The Cookie
Well,
Monster
I
always
do
comes
believe
back.
you're right that this obviously doesn't have anything to do with Joe Biden. He's not the one making these decisions. That said, as someone in chat points out, Russia has said that basically, like within 24 hours of the alleged authorization, Ukraine did strike Russian territory with one of these American-made missiles. I suppose that could be made up because, like you said, they've attacked Moscow with swarms of drones. Not like the small POV drones, but the big ones that are like small airplanes. Um,
Yeah.
Most of them are shot down, but they're attacking Moscow already, which is long range, obviously.
No,
The Russians,
100%.
So
the,
Just
the, the,
just to clarify my position,
yeah,
I'm not saying the strikes didn't happen. We have the confirmation that the strikes happened. I was just talking about Berdyansk Oblast. But my issue with this is I don't believe I believe there's a narrative on the Russian side where they think everything Ukraine does is done with the explicit approval, planning, and cooperation of the U.S. And 90% of the time, that is probably 100% true. But I would say there are many times where the Ukrainians go completely rogue, and the U.S. is just dragged along, following the Ukrainians into
Now
deeper and
hold
deeper
on.
waters.
Now hold on, Hunger. I think this is an excellent point to make here because the realistically, what is the Russian perception here? The Russian perception is you are arming, training, funding, equipping, providing every conceivable material necessary for the prosecution of a conflict. At what point does somebody become party to a conflict? And unfortunately, it seems that unless there is some sort of official declaration of war, you can play this little game, right? Where you can just endlessly arm people for all time and somehow you're not actually involved in any way. And so I think from the Russian perspective, that makes a little bit of sense. And the only weird differential here is that the United States is trying to prevent Ukraine from. But basically, they want Ukraine to be contained within its borders, but not necessarily to like. I think they were a bit shocked by the Kursk offensive. Frankly, I think that was not something that they were expecting. But I think that their shock is not that the Ukrainians did it. I think that their shock is that it doesn't make tactical or strategic sense to do it, which is a totally different question.
well, to back up Hungary's point and on Kursk, I think it is clear that Kursk was done without American knowledge, and it was an actual surprise attack on the Russians. From what I understand, the Ukrainians were concerned about leaks again, as with the 2023 counteroffensive. So they deliberately kept the Americans in the dark regarding their intentions, and that it actually was a legitimate surprise attack. And this would be one of those cases where America gets they very clearly attempted to drag America in their direction here, right? Because they attacked Kursk and then they immediately asked for missile authorization, and Biden wouldn't give it. So it's quite clear that they were trying to leverage America into doing what they wanted. So you're definitely there. I think there's ample evidence, Hunger, for that part of your point that 90% of the time, yeah, it's the Americans and the State Department, determining outcomes, but the Ukrainians are certainly acting their own in some ways, based on the information we have available.
Yeah, I mean, the Ukrainians have agency, and the danger of a proxy war is that the proxy is tied to the patron, and if the proxy acts irresponsibly, it is up to the patron to clean up the mess, and that's what's been happening for the past 2 years, basically. And again, like you mentioned, the Ukrainians have been asking for this authorization for over 6 months now.
It's quite possible they have gone rogue as well in this case, because another aspect to using these missiles now is the Russians know that Trump is coming in and seems to want to come to a peace agreement. So the Russians have reason to not escalate the war too far so that peace is on the table, which basically gives the Ukrainians massive escalatory powers because, okay, so Ukraine can just spend the next 2 months doing whatever they want to Russia. And if Russia reacts too strongly, it will scuttle the possibility of a peace plan, which is kind of the point I made at the beginning. But it makes sense from the Ukrainian perspective to start doing this now, because what are the Russians going to do if they act too strongly in a reciprocal manner? Well, then that's going to make the potential for peace much harder. And it's possible that there could be a reasonable peace deal coming out that they don't want to scuttle before it even begins. So that's another take I have on the missile use. And
Yes, to extrapolate on that point a little bit, if I may. So Russia doesn't really need to do anything different than what it's doing if what the New York Times is admitting is true, that the Ukrainians are spread thin and that they don't have the military forces on the ground to stop a Russian advance. So what is the only thing that Ukrainians can do to lash out is to basically use these missiles and provoke the responses you mentioned. Well, if Russia is patient and just says, well, okay, well, we have, anti-missile weaponry, we'll just shoot down half of your missiles and the other half will hit, and we'll just let it happen, whatever that's outside of our control. But we'll make sure that we achieve military victory in the field. That's the patient and the correct strategy, in my view, for Russia to adopt.
Well,
yes.
the more Ukraine does, the more Ukraine acts in this manner, the more politically expensive it becomes for the Russians, especially if civilian areas start getting targeted, and numerous civilians start dying. The Russians will have to retaliate. They can't let this stand, even though it would be the correct strategic move to do nothing and just ignore it and let Ukraine die slowly.
The only fact sorry, Charlie. I was just going to say the only thing I'll add to what Merchant just said there is that it also sort of depends too on the sentiment within Russia, because this can sort of go both ways, and we've sort of seen this over, sort of forget the West's military ventures of the last 50 years or so. I'm talking sort of like major wars of the 19th and 20th centuries. That sometimes these setbacks can act as a galvanizing force. Sort of, for instance, imagine like the Blitz in 1940 in England as an example, or Britain. It can be the sort of galvanizing force that rallies people, or inversely, it can sort of have the opposite sort of effect where if take like an obvious worst case scenario, take like the Italian war front. Once the Allies sort of touched Sicily, the government collapsed. I'm not saying that that's Russia necessarily, but the Italians gave up the ghost in 1943. And those are two sort of extreme examples of what I'm alluding to. But I'm sort of just saying these strikes and the civilian casualties in Russia can either be a galvanizing force that sort of, does strengthen Putin's position domestically, or it can actually erode his authority over the war, and it can potentially undermine the grand strategic vision that Russia has for conducting this war, and would force their hand to act in certain ways in order to maintain popular support for the war. So just I want to throw that out there because it can go in one of two directions.
Yeah, the problem though for the Ukrainians is I don't think they have enough missiles on hand to actually cause some sort of mass casualty events that would provoke the Russian state to attack. I mean, if they did, they would have to empty their arsenal and have no missiles left. This sort of gets into another. This doesn't show the missile counts, but I was watching, Binkov's 1,000 Days video today, and this was a pretty useful moment in the video right here where he goes over the aid, and you can see how the multiple launch rocket systems, HIMARS and things like that, they're basically not getting any of them. They're barely getting any howitzers anymore. Tanks, only 19 tanks have been given to Ukraine this year, right? So, but he makes the point just before this that aid to Ukraine hasn't really decreased overall. It's that it's going in different areas. It's going into F-16s. It's going into these missiles. It's going into other, it's going into financing their government. But the problem is these F-16s and these long-range missiles aren't actually what Ukraine needs. They do need more of these more low-tech things, and really beyond that, they just need shells, right? So
And
the
those are the
missile
very
strategy,
and those are the very
yeah,
things that NATO cannot provide. Just on a quantitative level, NATO has reeved through everything that it's able to give that is either surplus or slated surplus, and that includes the Australian M1 Abrams tanks that have been recently announced that were being given to Ukraine as well.
Yeah, the absolute bare necessity that the Ukrainian forces need at this point. I'm sure, like, you guys will either agree or disagree, but if Ukraine could pick a handful of things that it needs most, it is ammunition, both small arms and artillery shells, and it's in dire need of anti-air assets. That's I suppose it doesn't really have any means of acquiring S-300 ammunition, but these anti-air systems, Patriots and that sort of stuff, and the ammunition for them. We've heard now for months that whenever they do attempt to interdict Russian strikes, they basically salvo fire their sort of anti-air, sort of anti-missile batteries and attempt to intercept, and often do intercept a good deal of them. But it's such an expensive exercise for them that they just whittle down what ammunition stores they do have. And it's true to say that the Russians have probably targeted and knocked out many of these systems as it is. So, without those essential assets, this sort of other stuff feels a bit auxiliary, if I can use the word.
yeah. So I want to get to another topic, which is actually the proposed plan that Trump didn't really put it forward. This was kind of a leak, but I kind of regard this as something that Trump typically does, where he, when he's doing his negotiations, the art of the deal, he sort of puts forward like a more maximalist initial ask that can then be walked back to something that the other party is going to agree to. So, what we see here is this came out of the New York Times, first reported on it, and other media reported on it as well. It's basically that the one of the peace plans that the Trump camp is considering, and this was probably leaked intentionally, so that the Russians would see it and the uh, American public could get a grasp on where things are going to go, is basically the current front line would be frozen, and there'd be an 800-mile long demilitarized zone that would be patrolled by European peacekeeping troops, not Americans though. Problem with this, as you all are well aware, is that would really subvert Russia's entire goal, because their goal is to keep Ukraine out of NATO. If European troops are positioned directly in Ukraine on Russia's new border, well, effectively, you just have NATO in Ukraine now. So there's no way Russia could possibly go for this, because Russia doesn't want European, which is basically just to say NATO, troops in Ukraine. So it's a no go on that. Secondarily, and maybe this will lead us into looking at maps, the Russians have annexed the entirety of Lugansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson oblasts, which they don't yet control. But the Russians consider that Russian territory. The world has not recognized that yet. But I don't think the Russians did that. And I mean, basically, there's no walking that back. They're not going to de-annex Russian territory. There's no way the Russian Federation can accept any peace, and I think that's partially why they did that. Is they set their own minimum peace requirements in those annexations.
It's
There's
a
no
hard
way the
line for them,
Russians
right?
exactly. It's a Russian hard line. They are simply not going to accept a peace that doesn't include the entirety of the oblasts. And third, why why, well, third and fourth. Third, the Russians are moving so quickly now, especially in Donetsk. What possible incentive do they have to freeze the lines? I mean, the Ukrainian military in southern Donetsk, that line has been completely collapsed and blown open. The Russians advance literally multiple kilometers a day at this point across a broad section of that front.
Yeah.
So
It's average 40 to
why
50 kilometers since the fall of Avdiivka. So, they've got momentum, right?
yeah, so it's like why in your moment of the moment where you finally broken the Ukrainian defense lines and achieved an actual breakthrough, why would you thus freeze the conflict? And then fourth, and this is my final part of this, is like, well, what possible reason would Russia have to trust that this deal would be maintained, right? Like we've had Minsk 2, then we've had the scuttled peace negotiations by Boris Johnson back in 2022. It's like this is something I've harped on, since we've been doing these streams over the last 1,000 days. Like the problem with what the U.S. has done is that there's no believable deal that can be made. There's like the Russians. That's the problem. Is the Russians can only end this war by imposing terms because they can't trust that any deal will be kept to. So you would, in order to actually make a deal, it would have to be far better than this in terms of what you're on paper giving the Russians. Now, can Trump achieve that? I mean, one thing to point out here. Sorry, Mandrel, and then I'll stop. But this is easily the most difficult deal Trump will have ever had to negotiate in his entire life. Like negotiating the end of this war, which has gone on for 1,000 days now, this eclipses any other deal he's ever made. And does he understand and is he prepared to make the does he understand what the Russians actually want, and is he prepared to give them that, which at minimum is the 4 oblasts? And also, I keep remembering more things here, but the other problem, a fifth problem with this plan is a 20-year period where Ukraine will not be allowed to join NATO. That's also not acceptable. Ukraine, from the Russian perspective, can never be in NATO. They don't need 20 years to prepare for Ukraine being in NATO. They need it to never be in NATO. And that is fundamentally why the war happened, because the territory going basically from Kiev to Moscow, as Jimmy Thomas, or now Operational Art of War, his channel has explained, that territory doesn't have the type of canalizing terrain that Russia would need to defend it. It cannot be defended effectively. So there's no time period where it's safe for Ukraine to be in an enemy military alliance. So yeah, the whole thing is this whole peace plan that I think is not really serious so much as an initial um, big ask. That's the problem with it. Anyway, Raging Mandrel, go ahead.
Well, I just sorry if I was muttering under my breath there for half a second. My internet cut out, so I don't know if that you guys could see me still or whatever. But anyway, the point I wanted to make is about the missiles as being a rather de-escalatory or a phenomenon, or rather an escalatory phenomenon. The missiles that have been given are going to incentivize Russia to keep fighting. They're not going to have the effect of getting Russia out of the conflict and saying, "Oh no, we're done." If it has the opposite effect, in my opinion, and from the Russians I've talked to, this seems to be the attitude, and they think that this is a kind of a step too far. And you have to remember, anything that Ukraine has been given now, conceivably, is going to be given to Ukraine in the future. And you can see the NATO rhetoric in terms of Ukraine's transition to NATO weaponry. Well, that means in future, after Ukraine has also attrited every last piece of Soviet equipment it had pre-war and every last piece of Soviet equipment it had during the conflict that's been provided, now they have to rely totally on Western weapons, which means in future, all of these weapons are going to be fully integrated into the Ukrainian military. And Russia will have to deal with that in 5 years, 10 years, whenever another conflict possibly brews up. So there's no incentive in that regard for Russia to stop.
Yeah, and like it's I think the phrase you're looking for is escalate to de-escalate. Like this has been a failing strategy since the beginning of the war. I mean, even during the Obama days, like the strategy was escalate to de-escalate. Oh, we'll send more lethal aid to the Ukrainians to fight the Donbass rebels. And how did that work? How did that work out? You know, Russia kept escalating and escalating until we had Minsk, and then when that fell apart, you know, had a full scale invasion. But and it's also like what Charlie said. The Americans have been agreement incapable for since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and this has been a huge Russian talking point ever since, you know, the late '90s. Oh, they bombed Serbia. They brought Eastern Europe into NATO when they promised they wouldn't, you know, but there was nowhere in agreement. So, you know, America got off scot free on that one. This is a continuous problem, and Trump, for all of his great domestic policies, I this is not it's not workable. It's not workable. The terrain is not defensible. Russia is going to take much more of this, and exactly. I mean, why would they stop? Even if they don't want to go into Western Ukraine, I mean, it will be very hard in terms of Russian public opinion if Kharkov and Odessa are also not brought back into the fold. It would just be psychologically very hard because of the culture, the history of those regions, because of the demographics of those regions. And if if Putin's minimum offer is just the four oblasts, that still gives him a huge footing in Kherson on the right bank of the Dnieper. And that will always be a huge security threat, not just to Europe, but to NATO, because NATO does not want Russia to have a bridgehead on the right bank of the Dnieper.
Exactly, and also one so close to the proximity of Transnistria as well. Just to mention that, and just add to your point, Merchant, as well, in terms of the likelihood of certain how can I put this, certain parts or certain regions that would be appealing to the Russians and places to have their eye on. Probably slightly to a lesser extent, but you could almost add Sumy and Chernigov to that list as well, insofar that they are the regions of Ukraine that actually have the closest proximity to Moscow as well, and allow the potential for NATO and Ukraine, by extension, um, greater access to strikes upon Moscow and the Moscow area. So you'd imagine that in the event of a peace, it would be if you put yourself in the mentality of or the mindset of the Russians for a moment, them wanting to push that border further south and west from the northern part of Ukraine probably makes sense too. Whether they achieve that or not is a different story. But I almost would add Sumy and Chernigov into that similar category of Kharkiv and Odessa at this point.
Yeah, someone asks about this channel that Thomas put up. I will switch the screen share to his new channel, which has been very informative for all of us. So go subscribe to this channel where he is doing, well, one of the first real deep dives into what happened in the beginning phases of the war, as well as some other stuff about, what is a tank? Are tanks obsolete? This sort of stuff. All very interesting. So do check that out. Anyway, so yes, this is kind of leading us into where the war is going. We've talked about how this is a war of attrition, and what you really need to be looking at in this war is the attrition and not the lines on the map that are moving. And there would come a time when the Ukrainian military would be broken, and then you would start seeing the lines on the map move again. And I think we've reached that point, at least in southern Donetsk. The territory in southern Donetsk is no longer defendable by the Ukrainians. There's clearly been a breakthrough in their lines, and they're unable to establish a viable defensive line that can slow down the Russian advance. In fact, this would be a good moment to actually bring up one of the clips we wanted to look at, and put it and share it on the screen. Let me go ahead and open this thing. Can I open it in Brave? No, that's really annoying. Let's see. I'll have to pull up the tweet. My bad. So we'll watch this little video clip really quickly that'll show how fast the Russian advance has accelerated as compared to where it was the last time we streamed. So just give me one more second here. Share screen. Where is... I want to share Safari. There we go. Okay. I'll reset this at the beginning. And I will full screen it. You guys can see this, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, man, all good.
Yeah, so what? This is April. It started in April 2024 after the fall of Avdiivka. And you can just sort of see here, Okrotine has been taken now. There's a big advance towards Nova Adrika from Okrotine. If you look in the south around Ugladar, you can see Ugladar. Yeah, I mean, I'll just let it play a few times. It starts in February, and then ends actually about a month ago.
Oh, Charlie, we're having trouble seeing it now. It looks we're just getting a full screen. There you
there
go.
it is. There it is.
Okay,
Yeah, there we go.
We could see the tabs, but no content. But it's good now.
Oh, my bad. Okay, well, I'll let it play like this. And we'll just let it repeat a few times so the viewers can see it really quickly. And it's quite obvious looking at this that the Russian advance increases in its pace tremendously in the span of a few weeks. And this is the rate that is currently being sustained. Really, right at the very end of this video is when things really start moving quickly. And it's moving just as quickly now. I have another video.
Right after the fall of Ugladar is when it really starts to kick off.
Yes, I have another video that goes a little bit further into the future that I will play, and we can talk over it because it's 2 minutes long. And before playing this, actually, what I will do is go to a map so that viewers can see which part of the front line we're actually looking at here. So I will bring up Defense Politics Asia's map, which isn't necessarily the best map, but I like their coverage. I like the way they do their mapping. Let's see.
Just to while we're navigating this, just Guy Samaras here with a good point. It knows how the Russian advance increases as Ukraine pushed into Kursk region. That's also true, but then sorry, I think it was Mantle that said it. It also increased in pace too with the fall of Ugladar, and also with the breakthrough at Ocheretina and the initial collapse of that front line. Those factors all coinciding at once, you could definitely see an acceleration after those events, occur.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting point to be made here, Furious, because the stated purpose of the Kursk offensive on the part of the Ukrainians didn't actually achieve what it was meant to achieve. And there's a strategic question to be asked, which is, well, if you weren't able to be successful there, would it not have been more beneficial to have employed the forces that you used in that offensive in defending Prorez or Ocheretina or even Vugledar?
Yeah, I'm actually going to switch to deep states too because I can draw on it. So here's the deep state map. This is pro-Ukrainian, but they have most of the updates. So the area we're looking at is right around Donetsk. If we zoom in on the front here, this entire area, I'll get their pen tool, which is why I came here. This whole part of the front is what we watched collapse in that video following the fall of Avdiivka. And it might also be useful. One of the nice things on this map is you can go back in time. So we're on November 20th, 2024. If I go back to November 20th, 2023, we can see where the front was, right? So here was the front exactly 1 year ago from where we are now. You can see Avdiivka hadn't fallen yet. They're beginning to encircle it. And now I will hit today, and you can see the massive amount of territory that's been taken. And you can see right here are the borders of Donetsk Oblast, roughly. And this is really what the Russians are aiming for. Is you have to remember, a lot of people mistakenly refer to like the Russians taking forever to conquer Ukraine, but that's not actually their minimalist goal at the moment. What they need is this territory right here. This is the line they're trying to reach. And the problem for the Ukrainians is Pokrovsk is here, and behind it there's really nothing defensible. So as soon as the Russians actually complete what it looks like they're doing, which is probably a much larger pincer or double envelopment on Pokrovsk, then Pokrovsk will fall and the rest of the southern Donetsk region will fall, because that's what they've been doing in these areas. You can see we have, I'll use another color, we have a large pincer right now around Kurakove. They keep cutting off these larger and larger chunks of Ukraine and then biting down on it. And if we, if we zoom in here, If we zoom in here, we can also see they've attacked around Velika Novosilka. And yeah, I guess we just get into the frontline updates at this point. So we're in frontline updates part now. Does anyone want to say anything before we artistically look at this map?
Yes. So
Yes.
for the purposes of the bet, I will say I think I got two things incorrect. I initially thought that the Russians would advance along the highway towards Pokrovsk and towards Krakowa. That has obviously not been the case.
Let me share that. I'll share your prediction.
Yes, they had a rail line that goes directly from Avdiivka around in like a half circle S shape to Pokrovsk, basically, that we didn't notice on the map. And that was the pathway that they basically followed, because that rail line goes through Ocheretina and Porez down to Pokrovsk. And so the next thing is they haven't actually begun attacking Pokrovsk yet properly in the classic Russian double envelopment, which has basically been the Russian doctrine during this war. And I think what they're doing instead is attacking Kurakova, because that denies the Ukrainians a bunch of defensible terrain that they can use to help solidify the situation in Pokrovsk. Otherwise, they would have to attack both places at the same time, and that's just not good.
Just to add to that point, I mean, there's another reason why they're not attacking Pokrovsk, is because that Ocheretina offensive created a huge bulge, and it's very dangerous to have a huge bulge in your front line, because you yourself could be counterattacked and encircled. So the safe choice is always to level the front line and to maintain good logistical supplies that are not under threat of enemy counterattacks.
Yes. Let me quickly. We'll watch that happen. Actually, I will share this muted video, and we'll skip past this intro and begin watching the time lapse. So this is 22nd of February after the fall of Avdiivka. So shortly you'll see an advance in the north towards Okrotine, and this will create, like you said, a bulge in the front line that could be attacked from either flank. So this required the Russians basically to, well, it didn't require them. The risky maneuver would be to continue doing that. But what they did instead is, flatten the front lines. We see Okrotine is being taken right now, and then it kind of rapidly expands into the surrounding areas. And there'll be an advance to the west out of Okrotine up towards the top of the map along that rail line. So another very quick advance is about to happen along the rail line. Once that is achieved, that creates the same problem where now their flanks are exposed. They've got a salient that's a couple miles long, and they have to flatten the front again. So you can see quite clearly at this point, Pokrovsk is in the upper left. They're not really going directly for Pokrovsk. You see the front line advancing all along this area to keep it relatively flat, so that there's less frontage to defend and fewer places that the Russians can be outflanked from. So there was the big advance that I mentioned. This is kind of where things start falling apart for the Ukrainians, because now they're going to move south from that area they advanced to near Pokrovsk, and they're going to move very quickly. And then they're going to start encircling Seladove, and then they're going to start going for Giernik and Ukransk, and they're going to start approaching Kurakove, which is there in the south. And you can see that giant salient.
I wish this map was a little bigger so we could see Volgodar, because there were multiple pockets that happened at that same time.
Exactly, yeah. And we saw that on the previous map we were looking at. Around Ugledar, the same exact thing is happening right now. And we'll go back to the Deep State map and just highlight that after this finishes. It's going to get all the way to November. So yeah, you can see this illustrates quite clearly that they did not go directly for Pokrovsk in the way one might have thought they would. They stopped very deliberately in one particular part of the front. Here's the Deep State map. So they stopped right here. And the Russians have not gone past this line for months at this point. Now, why is that? Is it because the Ukrainians are just, that good and they're able to hold off their attacks? Well, partially. There's good defensive terrain here. I think this is high ground, and there's a lot of defensive structures that have been built up here. So partially, yes. But the Russians aren't interested in attacking Pokrovsk directly from the front without having done their typical strategy, which is to secure the flanks first. So cut off this road. Mirnograd is its own large conglomeration. So what the Russians typically do, of course, is they secure the flanks of any city they're trying to attack, which means advancing up here and advancing over here, which you can see they're doing, right? They recently actually took Seladove. That's a large urban conglomeration that they recently took, and now they're going up the rail line a bit, but they're also going this
and
way.
for the record, taken quite rapidly as well, despite being a large city.
Yes, that's a big change we've seen now, too, is cities just sort of fall after being encircled now, rather than being fought for. Now, the Seladove was kind of different from a few other cases where there was fighting in the city for a couple of weeks. I think the Ukrainians were much more interested in holding this city because after Seladove, there's nothing along this rail line anymore. This is one of those rail lines that the Russians are so good at advancing on. There's nothing protecting Pokrovsk from this direction now because Seladove was taken. Well, as you can see, the Russians are not simply going directly up the rail line. They're actually expanding more to the west out of Seladove. And why? That's because they want to reach the end of Donetsk Oblast. And then from this area, they will then outflank Pokrovsk. And they will outflank Pokrovsk by probably attacking this junction in the highway and then advance from this direction on Mirnograd. So I believe this is what they're trying to do, and that's why we didn't see some massive assault on Pokrovsk, because as we've seen, that's just not how the Russians do it. They're always going to secure the flanks first. We can see same thing with Kharkove. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, if I can say one thing about Seladove too before we move on.
Yep.
Just for the audience's awareness, Seladove is a town of about 20,000 people. Avdiivka was a town of about 30,000. Bakhmut is about 50 or so. So you can kind of see these are similar sized towns roughly, and the ferocity and the willingness of the defenders to basically fight I hate to say the word to the last man, but basically they're fighting extremely ferociously for months on end, whereas Seladove is a town that is an urban area that has decent terrain, decently defensible terrain, and they let it go in a much shorter span of time than Avdiivka, which is a similar size. So it's very interesting to see that happen. That's why Selidove is significant.
And we can see I've jumped back to 1 month ago, October 20th here. And then if we look at how we can see how rapid the advance has been. So here's October 20th and here's today. They take Saladove and then they expand far beyond the outskirts of the city. And now they're closing on Kurakove. The other thing on this part of the front, and I think we'll spend most of the time just talking about this part of the front, is the collapse of Ugladar. So, of course, Ugladar was under the control of the Ukrainians since the very beginning of the war. The Russians were not able to take it. There were some famous assaults on Ugladar that failed miserably for the Russians. It was very embarrassing. And this Ugladar is important because it is a tight block of apartment buildings that overlook vast plains, basically. Like in this entire radius around Ugladar, it's very flat. There aren't really forests to speak of, so assaulting Ugladar is very difficult because you can be seen coming. There also aren't a lot of roads leading into Ugladar. But now Ugladar has been taken. And what that allowed to happen is a massive explosion in the front lines, very similar to what happened after Avdiivka. Ugladar has been taken, and now if we jump from September 20th to today, we can see that basically opened up this entire area behind Ugladar, and it's now threatening Velika Novoslika, which is one of the last parts of southern Donetsk that the Russians have been trying to assault for a very long time and have not been able to make it through. You can see the green here is area the Ukrainians took back in their counteroffensive. But this time around, yeah.
From Velika Novosilka, there is a straight road west to Zaporozhye city.
Yes, that is where all this leads. So if we look here, there's another town called Pokrovsk. Dnipro Oblast is actually along this line right here. But what I believe the Russians intend to do is actually go through Dnipro to get to Zaporozhye, because if they do that, they will follow this highway that comes into the north of the city. And this will be key.
There's also a rail line here along that highway as well, so that's a perfect axis of advance for them to do that.
There is. The rail goes from, let me finish this point, but obviously this junction needs to be cut in order to take Zaporozhye, because this is going to be one of the main supply lines. So the Russians want to follow this road right here. And that road goes through Dnipro. Whoops. And yes, the rail line you mentioned, I can't quite see it on the map, but it goes like this. Something like this. It goes to Pokrovsk. And there's more rail this way. Like there's a split somewhere around like right here. And as we know, the Russians are very good at advancing on the rail lines. That's the main thing they exploit, is because the rail lines have windbreaks on either side of them, tree lines that protect the Russian soldiers from being seen. So the rail lines are going to be key. And yeah, I think where all this leads to is they have to get to this highway and then head straight west to Zaporozhye. Likely, we will see an attack coming from the south as well. If the Russians can get through if the Russians get to Pokrovsk, and continue going, we'll probably see an attack come here as well. They're going to go for Orikhiv, and they're going to prepare, to advance along these multiple axes, right? These three major highways into Zaporozhye. That, I believe, is the Russian plan here. Obviously, they want to take Donetsk, but how does this figure into the larger strategic picture of what their aims are? And I think that's what.
So I think that the best way to cross river is by having two places to cross at once, which means that strategically the Russians will be obligated to not just take Zaporizhia, but they'll probably try to push on Dnipro as well. And as I mentioned before, yes, there are rail lines again on that northern road, that highway from Pokrovsk to Pavlograd and down to Dnipro as well.
Yes, right
so that's that's another axis of advance. So after Pokrovsk is taken, I would imagine that there'll probably be fairly heavy fighting in Pavlograd along that row line.
Interesting. That makes sense. The thing about Zaporozhye is most of the city is actually on the eastern side. So they could actually basically take Zaporozhye without crossing. But obviously they will have to cross to get the rest of the oblast. But I think what you're saying makes sense. They will probably go for Dnipro as well, so that there's two places that they can cross. And
Well, on one hand,
my
it
map
forces
bugged out a
also
little bit.
Ukraine to commit reserves to two places at once, which, given the state of their armed forces, is not a position I want to find themselves in. Just just quickly on this point about Dnipro and Zaporozhye, is that if we can talk about sort of like a brief summary of the conduct of the war, sort of writ large, and if we can highlight one, I mean, there's obviously been L's and W's on both sides, but if Russia has suffered an L, Charlie, can you just move the map like downwards and leftwards ever so slightly to sort of, yeah, if we can look at like the bridgehead across Kherson Oblast there. So just yeah, that's perfect. You can see here, for Ukraine, this was quite the W to have thrown the Russians back, and this is when they first got access to the long range ammunition and missiles, which Ukraine did obviously use back in like late 22 and throughout 23. They were striking the Antonov Bridge and forced Russia to withdraw their troops from the other side of the bridgehead here at Kherson, because had they actually still held at least some of this territory, they would have posed a very real threat, not only to the you might say offering an axis of advance to Zaporozhye from the southwest, but they could have also struck at Kiev, which is directly to the north of that bridgehead. You can see just left of Charlie's mouse. No, that's my mouse. Sorry. Kiev is just to the north of that bridgehead. Yeah, if you just move that mouse north and slightly to the right, Charlie. There we go. Thank you. Yeah, Kiev. Yeah. No, that's it. You had it. Yeah, and that would have essentially from the western side would have cut off Zaporozhye firstly, and then secondly would have narrowed Dnipro's axis of resupply as well. So this is actually one instance whereby forcing the Russians to withdraw across the river was very much a W for Ukraine, even though Ukraine did suffer a lot of losses attacking many areas of this sector. They did succeed in forcing the Russians to withdraw, and that's just when what's his name was appointed, that the bald general. He's the one who Serovikin, thank you. He masterminded the withdrawal back across. They banned essentially the greater part of Kherson city and the bridgehead on the Oblast. So I know this is a bit of a distraction, but it does impact on what the Russian strategy would be for Zaporozhye, and also just to sort of touch on an event that has sort of come and gone, but obviously has had ramifications going forward.
Yeah, sorry. I'm actually eating seaweed bits to get a little bit of salt to keep me awake. I've been tactically muting, so apologies if you hear crunchy sounds. Anyway, yes, I think the most important thing the Ukrainians have done this entire war is get the Russians to withdraw from the right bank of the Dnieper. If they had this foothold still, it would be very grim for Ukraine, because ultimately it's going to be very difficult for them to make this crossing. That said, I don't think it will be as difficult as many will imagine, because if they defeat the Ukrainian army in the field on the left bank of the Dnieper, there's not going to be an army left to defend the right bank, right? It's like, yeah, it's any sort of amphibious assault against an entrenched opponent. It's always going to be very difficult. But if they can take, the left bank of the river down to here, there's just going to be too many potential crossing sites for the Ukrainians to actually hold on to. And I think one of the most interesting things coming up is, I expect we'll get an answer to this sometime in 2025, is are the Russians going to enter the Dnipro Oblast? Because it doesn't seem possible to take Zaporozhye without entering Dnipro. I mean, technically they could come up like here, right? But that's not nearly as good of an axis of advance as going straight from your rail hub in Donetsk all the way to Zaporozhye, right? It just doesn't make any sense to withhold from Dnipro, especially since the Russians are in Kharkov, they haven't annexed, right? So I think we will see the Russians enter this little like bulging part of of Dnipro Oblast, and whether or not they go for the city of Dnipro itself, I don't know. I think their aims right now are to take Donetsk because Donetsk and Lugansk, those are the key battle spaces, and that's why I'm focusing on this so much. Is Donetsk really is the key battle space of this entire war? Lugansk has been taken, right? They have like 99.13% of it. You can see the line, right here. The Ukrainians have like a toehold of Lugansk, but that kind of doesn't matter, right? All of this green that the Russians left, that was all Kharkov, which they haven't actually annexed. So there's no need for the Russians to take back any of this green area up here. What they need is Donetsk Oblast fundamentally, which is here. Now, there's still a lot of it to take, but the thing is, if the Russians take Pokrovsk, they will basically have this entire southern portion under their control. And
they'll be able to outflank the STD defensive line of cities right there.
Yeah, exactly. Then this is going to be hopeless after that. So I think the Russians really want to achieve this before Trump comes into office, or at least shortly after. They want to say, look, you got this, you have this plan for us, but we're within reach of our goals. So trying to come up with a deal that makes us fall very short of our goals is just ridiculous, and we're not going to accept it. So I believe that's what the Russians are looking at right now, is how do we set ourselves up to at least make it appear very reasonable for our minimum aims to be met in any peace plan.
I completely agree. Just go ahead, Marcus.
Sorry, man. No, just that the comment came up that Albert just mentioned, because I was actually going to tack on to what I said about the Kherson Oblast and the bridgehead. Is that another L, sort of categorically for the Russians, probably slightly less of an L, but an L nonetheless. Is if you move the map up towards Izium, Charlie, the Kharkov Oblast, you can see here that can you just zoom in ever so slightly, like 1 or 2 clicks, just so we can see. No, that's all right. So just so we can see Liman as well. Liman and Izium basically provide like two, like a pair of Damocles swords that hang over the Kramatorsk and Slavyansk salient, and if Russia still held one or two or both of them, they would basically have both those cities in something of like a semi-double development. But the fact that Russia lost this part of Kharkov Oblast has actually been quite a setback in terms of their grand strategy. Because you can sort of see with the capture of Bakhmut, they've already got a bit of a southern shoulder developing underneath Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, and are now on the doorstep of Konstantinivka. But losing that northern part of the front there has because they captured Izium fairly early in the war, and I think Liman fell like mid 22, so they got them quite early in the war. But that surprise push that Ukraine pulled off, I think it was at the maybe 8 or 9 months into 22 or the end of 22, and Russia just hasn't recovered them. So
it coincided with the Ukrainian attack also in Kherson as well.
Exactly. Yes. So because I remember they were sort of reporting like the first contact in Balaklia, and it was basically, what was it, like the Russian gendarmerie, like they didn't even like technically have troops in Balaklia. It was like military police. So if Russia did suffer 2 L's in that sense, it was definitely those 2 sectors in my opinion anyway.
I mean, this is all from the first year of the war, but Charlie, if you can go back to the deep state map, there's one more very important update other than the Kurakova front that's taking place. If you can go back to deep state.
Yeah, I was just getting the date. So yeah, it looks like September 2022.
That's right. Yeah.
Is when the Ukrainians took back that area that we just talked about. But
pretty much the only undeniable win the Ukrainians have had in 1,000 days. But going back to deep state. So if you zoom out just a little bit, I was very famous for my prediction that there would be a big aero offensive from Kharkov. That did not happen, but we have
There's
a
just a little
very
poke.
interesting, just a little, like, 10, 12 kilometers, not too bad. But the very interesting scenarios on the Oskil River and the Kupiansk front, which I
Yeah,
predicted would be, the reason for a big aero offensive from Kharkov. And after multiple failed offensives, Russia has finally broken through. Russia has broken through south of Sinkivka. I think Deep State is being a little biased here, but the other breakthrough. So they've reached the Oskil River. They're biased in the sense that the Russians are literally on the outskirts of the eastern bank of the Oskil River. They are literally in the suburbs of Kupiansk, and south of that, the town of Pischane. Yeah, so that's Kupiansk.
I mean,
And
you can
Kupiansk is
kind of see it
divided.
like this. The Russians
That's go.
apparently went down this road and just went here. Uh,
That's go.
I imagine that this whole area is probably de facto Russian because what is that like? This is a 3 kilometers, a couple miles. You're telling me they just drove like 3 miles and no one stopped them, and then like turned around and left. So yeah, this is really bad.
So yeah,
That's like
so
Chernigov Oblast in like March 22, like just careering
yeah,
down a road. Sorry,
yeah,
continue.
no, that's exactly it. And Kupiansk is the logistics center. I mean, once, not to shit on the Ukrainians too much, but it was very retarded for them to have this giant pocket east of the Oskil River after the fall of Pischane. I mean, there's two Pischanes, but obviously I'm talking about the one in red. And once the Russians broke out of Pischane and reached the Oskil River, like, the Ukrainians should have withdrawn immediately. And
Yeah,
this front,
this whole area is now screwed. Anyone in here, if they don't leave, they're a POW because,
yeah,
as you said, the Russians took from Pischane, they reached the Oskil River. There are not many crossings for this river. In fact, the only crossing of this river to the north
is
is in
Kupiansk.
Kupiansk. And if the Russians clearly advanced to this road very intentionally, because by advancing to this specific spot right here, they are signaling, hey, if you're in this area right here, you're dead. You're now our prisoner if you don't get out immediately. So I expect that we're just going to see this whole area collapse fairly quickly once whatever is happening around Kupiansk's eastern side is like actually acknowledged, because there's simply no way to maintain this. Like they're not going to build pontoon bridges every single day that get destroyed by missiles to supply this. It's just impossible. So
And you're gonna have to
I would be
you're gonna have to cross the river in winter, in the dead of winter, which is absolute hell.
yeah. So this area is basically done for, and that's because of this. Not much talked about because of what's happening in Donetsk, but when they took Peshane and then reached the Oskil River, it cut this part of the front in two. On that, we've also seen them. This is the Zerbets River. They've pushed all the way up to the Zerbets River too, except in this one area just by Turny, leading south to like Limania right here.
Y-
So
so sorry, just on that basis, Charlie. Yeah, you can see Torske here, just south of that group of lakes, um, and yeah, Torske down the bottom there, and Yump Hill, and essentially once those are taken, their ability to recapture Liman opens up. But there's a whole lot of forest here, and I believe this is the sector where they've been using a lot of those. What are those multiple the launch? Oh, I'm trying to think
Flamethrowers.
of the flamethrower or the
Toss.
barricade.
MLRS, the multiple launch rocket systems, the TOS
Yeah,
system.
the thing of the toss systems, yeah, and they're quite sort of harrowing to face. Apparently, they sort of use like some kind of sort of incendiary um, uh, sort of like payload on them that is sort of terrifying in forested areas, and the Russians have been using them kind of extensively here. I think Mandrill and Merchant, you might have a better idea of them than me, but I do sort of hear them reported about sort of fairly persistently, and they're very active in this part of the front because I believe they're first deployed on the outskirts of Kremlin when the front was just there, about a year and a half ago.
I mean, they've advanced into this forest because, I mean, in winter, obviously, there's not going to be the cover, the amount of cover or foliage. I mean, unless they're pines, but I don't know that case. But they already have a large section of this forest. So, given, I mean, the Ukrainians and the Russians have been throwing flamethrower rounds at each other since the beginning of the conflict, and that's no surprise because the forest is very dense and you can't move armor into these territories. But I mean, given the fact that Ukraine is losing manpower everywhere, I don't. It'll only be a matter of time before they lose these forests as well.
Yeah, this is a critical part of the front line. I mean, to the credit of the Ukrainians, like whoever's defending Seversk, I forget the name of the brigades, but are basically the greatest of all time uh, heroes of the war. I mean, they've been defending this front, and it basically hasn't moved for like 2 years. So this whole forest right here that the Ukrainians control, and also this line in front of Seversk, has been absolutely rock solid. But yeah, you're right. Eventually, this is going to collapse. And the problem is once the Russians actually get some sort of a breakthrough in this forest, maybe they achieve it simply by, they have been encroaching slowly on Seversk. Maybe they're in Vinka too, like this map doesn't acknowledge it. I think they're more advanced here too. But in any case, it's possible that eventually they do get a breakthrough to Seversk, and then they can outflank the forest completely, and it will all become Russian. That this is really one of the key terrain features of this entire war that's not really talked about. Is this large forest right here is doing so much work for the Ukrainians, because the forests, really big forests like this, which there aren't a lot in Ukraine. People talk about forests, but really big forests like this one, there are not many of them, and it always slows down the Russians substantially when they are fighting in a forest. It's very good defensive terrain for the Ukrainians.
So this was all under Russian control after the initial invasion. So I've always been quite surprised that they let this area go so quickly and so easily. Once the initial invasion failed to achieve any sort of forward movement, like this was should have been like the Russians should have basically fortified this area pretty soon after they figured out that the initial invasion was not a success. So I've always been flabbergasted that they haven't held this and that they let the Ukrainians have it, because now they have to retake it the hard way.
I
Well, I
can tell you
think
another
that
reason
just signals.
why that happened.
Yeah, go
Go
ahead.
ahead. Oh yeah. So
Well,
the
I
reason,
was
I mean,
just
the
gonna
reason
say. I
that
was just gonna
happened.
say. I was just
Go
gonna
ahead. Go
say
ahead.
that the collapse was simply that bad for the Russians. Like the collapse in Lugansk in September 2022 was completely real, and they just barely managed to stop the rout. Like this was a legitimate rout, and that's why the forest was let go, because it could not be held. The forces were routing.
I mean, you got to think. Yeah, I was going to say you got to think that the because someone else just posted to here the for the hang on, I just saw the comment here just before. But anyway, the point being is that the Russians did attempt initially, from what we can tell, to hold the Oskil River, and then actually had to fall behind the Oskil River and to the river behind that, which even then the Ukrainians managed to like penetrate parts of it. And as I sort of mentioned before, the Russians ended up sort of deploying forces on the outskirts of Svatove and Kremina, because both these defensive belts that the Russians did withdraw behind, just they weren't able to maintain a like a cohesive front line, which is essentially the kind of the fate that's sort of befallen Ukraine now with the fall of Avdiivka and Ocheretine. It's the same kind of phenomena that, when the enemy's encroaching at speed, you can't actually maintain a defensive line, sort of in the true sense of the word. Yeah, it was the militias, the was it the always forget the
LNR.
abbreviations.
DPR,
Yeah,
LPR.
yeah, thank you. Yeah. Basically like militia forces, and they just sort of melted in the front of being confronted with the new Western weapon systems that the Ukrainians had at that point in time, because that was like after the first real surge of weapon systems that the Ukrainians got their hands on, right?
Yeah,
Yeah, definitely.
this and the Western intelligence, ISR, was heavily involved in this counteroffensive as well. So
It just goes to show you, though, that the Russians made a huge mistake in not mobilizing their forces much, much earlier after the initial invasion, well, obviously failed. They should, the moment that it was apparent that they did not achieve the primary objective, which is to oust Zelensky, they should have immediately gone to mobilization.
Or when the peace got tanked, right? Knowing
Right,
that you
right.
Yeah,
saw.
because
Yeah.
this was all the way in September that this collapse happened. So there was plenty of time to get regular forces in there. But probably one of the only reasons this stopped too is the Ukrainians probably started reaching the limits of their logistical capability, especially once they crossed the Oskil, which is a substantial river, and then September, wouldn't have been frozen or anything. So, and then there was the second
The
river,
other
the Zerbets River.
Yeah, the other reason why, I mean, like you said, this was a complete rout. This was a total screw up on the part of the Russians, but it actually would have been much worse. People forget this. In the town of Liman, all the way down south, it's only like 20 kilometers from Slovyansk. In the town of Liman, there was one, I want to say, company, or maybe a battalion, very, very small battalion, I think, of volunteers. This is before conscription, that held out in Liman for about a week and were almost going to be encircled by the
They're on
Ukrainians.
Cossacks, if I remember correctly.
I think so. I think they were Cossacks until they were rescued by Russian paratroopers, VDV. That one, that 1 week of them fighting it out in Liman pretty much saved this entire front and allowed and held up a huge Ukrainian force for that other Russian forces to fall back on. So that was actually super critical, that moment that people forgot about in the early days of the war.
I actually remember that quite distinctly, and I think you make a good point. That sort of one delaying action definitely sort of ensured that the Russians weren't pushed back further than what they already were. I mean, one could have easily imagined that had that action not occurred, then probably Kremina and Svatove would have both been sort of imperiled. But that delay definitely bought the Russians time that they otherwise wouldn't have had.
Same thing happened in Slovyansk in the Second World War as well. The after Barbarossa, Slovyansk, the holdup at Slovyansk delayed the entire offensive.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, Smolensk, not Slovyansk, Smolensk.
Yes, Smolensk, completely different place. Um, okay, where were we? So we can go back to talking about this. I mean, this is a big problem because this part of the Oskil River is now separated from this part. So getting logistics down here is also more difficult now for the Ukrainians. This is an interesting part of the front because, yeah, I mean, the reason the Russians are here at all is because, like we said, they need to go for Izium because this allows them to outflank Slavyansk, which is a pretty large urban area, and you have to get behind it like this in order to take it. So that's going to take them a very long time, but possibly if they can take Pokrovsk and this entire southern area, they might be able to win Slavyansk without actually fighting for it. Because the problem is, although the Ukrainian military is collapsing in southern Donetsk, it's holding in pretty much every other part of the front to a reasonable degree still. So we could easily see the war continuing into 2026, 2027, if the Russians actually do have to fight it out for every single inch of territory they've claimed, right? That's the problem the Russians have, is that, and that rate could speed up. Who knows? It probably will, but it really depends on what Trump does. It's very much a wild card right now for the Russians. But yeah, the key right now is what's happening in Donetsk. I think is emblematic of things to come, because the collapse here, I talked about before how we've been talking about how this is a war of attrition, but eventually you would see the Ukrainian army break somewhere and a genuine breakthrough would be achieved by the Russians. And that could very well snowball into a breakthrough like at a more strategic level. And I think we're going to start seeing that now. It's quite clear that this entire front is collapsed. The Ukrainians cannot defend basically this entire part of the front. The Russians are going to, by next week, they're probably going to be either over here, or they will have taken all of this, or they will have taken all of this, or all three of those. Like, that's how fast the front line is moving now. Is a week from now, I fully expect the area north of the reservoir to be taken. This salient will probably be taken. And
They already control
you
a
know,
third of Karakova.
yeah, I mean, this is kind of this is the deep state UA map. They're already advancing actually into Kurakove. They've taken, what is this called, Dachny right here? Yes, Dalny. I forget what is the quote unquote correct one, but yeah, they've taken this, which allows them to cut off this road. That's important because the Ukrainians have a big defensive network right here, and that's now being outflanked from two different sides. The Russians have this. This road is operationally under, fire control, so that's going to collapse everything in this area right here. And the problem the Ukrainians have, and this is why they're talking about building a defensive line in Dnipro, is, which would be over here, is because the Russians are now moving fast enough to where some of the trenches we've seen in these areas are only half built. They're not actually finished. And you can tell this because like the top part of the trenches is still just board that hasn't been covered in earthwork. Now there are some older defenses here, but the problem is you can see the original front line over here. And that's where the strongest defenses would have been, right, in layers basically. And on this part of the front, they're going like this way, and on this side of the front, they're going like this way, right? There's these layered defensive networks of trenches, but they get weaker and weaker the further back you go because they are newer and newer and they haven't been developed as much. And some people say that there's like no defenses in this part of the front. I mean, there are defenses, but there are far less developed fortifications that the Ukrainians can use,
And that
and
becomes
they're being outflanked everywhere, right?
and fortifications become more effective the more defensible terrain you have. Whereas there's much less defensible terrain in the behind Pokrovsk in Donetsk and sorry, not Donetsk, in Dnipro and Zaporizhia areas, rather than in Donetsk proper, which has been built up for 14 years.
Yeah, so the basically the key battle we're looking at right now as well is Kurakove. This is actually what the Russians seem to be focusing on as opposed to Pokrovsk. Once they take Kurakove, which is actually where the Ukrainian HQ was, I imagine it's been moved now, probably to Andriivka or Constantinople, whatever, weird Ukrainian spelling. But this
the
is
other
going,
one, not the famous
They'll
one.
change the name next week.
yeah,
It'll have a new name next week.
yeah, it'll have a new name next, literally, because that's how fast the Russians are going. Like seriously, by next week, they are probably not going to advance here yet. I think on this flank, they are aiming more for Velka Novoselika, so they may take like this by next week. But you
It's
can see
definitely evident.
how.
Oh, so sorry, Charles. I just want to say, if you just move the map down just ever so slightly, just oh no, never mind.
Yeah,
I'm just going to make the point that definitely that they've been on the doorstep of Velika Novoselivka for months now, and even though they have sort of crept forward and taken Stayomayorsk and Makarivka, they are definitely looking to actually outflank the city rather than having to like face it front on in a headlong sort of confrontation sort of city battle. They're definitely going to try and pincer it because you can also see here on the where you're just to the west of Stayomayorsk, Rivnopil, which was actually a very significant defensive salient that the Russians held at the very beginning of that summer counteroffensive. Just to the west of Stayomayorsk, where the front sort of protrudes upwards into Ukraine's lines, Rivnopil. They're sort of again converging around Velika Novoselivka around two sides, and I think you'll find that once they sort of take that, when and if Russia does, they'll basically sort of pivot and rotate north and move into that sector where Constantinople slash Andriivka is, because then like their southern flank would be sort of more secure, so to speak.
Well, once
yeah.
they reach
I keep getting
Andriivka,
distracted by map autism as well. But the point I keep wanting to make is like we've gone back to a war of movement. So the Russians are not simply battling it out city by city, block by block, like they were doing at Barinka or even Gregoriivka, but they're now executing these larger maneuvers that require multiple operational groupings. I forget exactly where the dividing line between the armies are too, but like this is a different army grouping up here than the one down here. But they're now actually working together in a much more coordinated capacity, which is an interesting development because we're now seeing that at the beginning of the war, the Russians were not capable of operational maneuvering on this scale, but now they're actually capable of executing these fairly large uh, cauldrons, as people like to say, where instead of having to fight through this entire area, they simply envelop it, cut off the key points where the supply passes through, and then effectively force the Ukrainians to withdraw. So, and that's how this goes, right? They never fully close it off and get all the prisoners. The Ukrainians simply leave. And the problem with the Ukrainians just leaving and leaving and leaving is eventually you give up all the ground, right? And that's sort of the problem is we're now looking at a case where the Ukrainians just keep retreating over and over and over again from these key areas, and the places they're retreating to are even less and less defensible. Nothing we're looking at on the screen right now is particularly defensible in terms of what's been built up and the terrain in general. It's just mostly like flat farmlands with some tree lines in it. That's not what you need to defend. To defend, you want things like reservoirs. Giernik, I think, was the highest point in this region. So high ground.
Terracons.
Terracons, yeah, the terracons are the trash piles or refuse piles from the mines. There's one right here. There's one right here. Right, you need these things, but none of this is back here. And there's rail line too for the Russians to advance on. So the Ukrainians are in a serious issue right now or the Ukrainians have a serious problem right now because this front's just been completely blown open. And it's like, how do you stop this bleeding? It doesn't matter what they're doing in Kursk. It doesn't matter, what they're doing in Kharkov. Like, none of this is relevant to the actual front line, the key part of the battle right now, because this gap has to be closed. The Ukrainians have got to stop the Russians here on this broad part of the front. I mean, this is like 70 miles or something, right? There's like a 70-mile long effective breach in the Ukrainian front line. And if this is not closed, then they are simply cooked, as people say now, right? This problem has got to be dealt with. But it's clear the Ukrainians cannot deal with it, or they would have done so, right? That's the conclusion we can draw, is the Ukrainians have lost the ability to defend Donetsk. And since they cannot defend Donetsk, they will lose the war at an increasing rate because the Russians are simply going to use this to do larger and larger outflanking maneuvers to the point where they're able to outflank entire cities rather than these smaller towns of 30,000 people.
So I think we can probably talk about the patterns that we've seen in the war thus far too. One of the patterns which we haven't really gotten into on any of our streams is the Russians seem to understand the weather very well, and they craft their battle plans for these towns that they're taking to fight over them essentially in the winter time. Like this was the case with Avdiivka of earlier this year and late last year, and then Bakhmut before that. So maybe we could expect with Pokrovsk and Velika Novoselivka that those towns are going to have some kind of battle in the winter months when the ground isn't actually suitable for maneuver.
Problem during the winter too, when the ground is not suitable for maneuver, is this is the first winter where the Russians are going to have air superiority. And because the Ukrainians will not be able to move as easily, they're going to be much more vulnerable to the glide bombs that Russia has been using. I think they're using hundreds of them a month or something like that. I forget the number.
Yeah.
We covered it last stream. But losing the ability to maneuver may actually hurt the Ukrainians more than it helps them, because they're going to be hit by these glide bombs even more effectively because their equipment will not be free to maneuver. So, we'll see what happens. But
Yeah, I think Manjo makes a good point. I think Pokrovsk will be the target after this whole front line is flattened. Pokrovsk will be the target for winter 2025 because it's just I think it would just be easier to do urban warfare in the winter for the Russians because again maneuverability is limited.
so you think in the next 2 or 3 months, you're saying is they'll actually assault Pokrovsk?
Well, I mean, according to the weather, this like November and March are the rainy seasons. Where all like
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the famous mud season. So I think they're going to be targeting Pokrovsk during the muddy season.
So now,
It's
right?
yeah,
November.
yes, and you're seeing them try to, as you mentioned before, they're trying to begin outflanking Pokrovsk on the western side. So I would expect, given Russia's advantages both in artillery and as well as infantry, which the Ukrainians and Western sources like to complain about, especially nowadays, that's probably just think about tactical employment of forces. If you have advantages in certain areas, you have to use those advantages correctly. And if you have advantages in both artillery and infantry, in at least on a numerical level, and especially on the local level in the Pokrovsk sector, one of the things that you can do is force the Ukrainians into a battle that they essentially are obligated to fight. And this is when you cause maximal attrition, right? This is one of the reasons why Russia likes to use these cauldrons so often. You want to force the Ukrainians to defend a major city where they feel like they have a shot at using the terrain to their advantage, but you want to force this terrain operationally to be encircled, so that you can deal out as much attritional, a more favorable rate of attrition against the Ukrainians, basically.
I think the Russians are simply still too conservative to actually do this. I mean, how would you execute this attack? Let's just look at this grouping here. So they would continue advancing along this rail line, which would lead them here. There's rail line that could come this way, and perhaps they could execute. I mean, it doesn't really look like there's a major road here, but you would need to cross to this other rail line basically somehow, which suggests to me is they would actually want to control like all of this first if they're actually going to put a cauldron on Pokrovsk. The problem is that that's a lot of territory, right? Like they they need to take pretty much like all of this in order to actually do a cauldron. And then there are bodies of water right here that are helping stop advance. They're going to have to figure out how to actually assault over this and then move west. I mean, it seems like a pretty big operation. I don't think they're going to try it this year. I really don't. Maybe I'm wrong. I think they're going to focus more on southern Donetsk since that is where the opportunity clearly is. I don't know if this line is holding simply because of certain difficulties, if the Ukrainians are holding it more fiercely, or if the Russians are just focusing more down here. It's hard to really say why this part of the front is what's collapsing. But I think that they're going to focus on they're going to focus on taking as much ground as they can so that they can say, look, we have X% of Donetsk, um, as opposed to grinding it out in Pokrovsk and not getting the geography, because as we've talked about, like the the territory hasn't mattered that much for most of the war, but it could matter now with Trump coming into office and seeking to negotiate some sort of settlement. Now it actually could matter how much of the territory Russia has claimed they actually hold. And there's still quite a lot here just in southern Donetsk that they need to take in order to, bump up that number quite a lot.
They have
So,
65%, so they have
yeah,
35. So the Ukrainians
65%.
have 35%.
Yeah, so if they took this part, I mean, that would be what, like probably another 10%. So it'd be like 75-25. Uh, I could see them trying to go for that because I don't know. I mean, who knows what they're going to do? The Russians surprise us a lot in this war. I think mostly with their conservatism. I mean, they're also like attacking around Chasiv Yar. Why is this happening? I don't really know. Um, they've
Well,
slowly
Would you
gotten
like my
across
theory
it.
on that?
yeah, I
Would
have
you
a
like my
theory
Well,
theory
too.
on that?
Chasiv
It's a
Yar is the high ground in this area. I think in combination with the attack on Touretsk, they're
exactly.
planning on going for Konstantinivka, which is why I kept saying they're going to attack this part of the road because you cut this road and you get onto this flank of Konstantinivka from Chasiv Yar, you get onto this flank from this highway, and you get on its front flank from taking Touretsk. I mean, it's pretty obvious what they're doing here. I mean, like, why are they doing this right now? And what relationship does this have to do with? Does this have with Pokrovsk? Um,
So I have a theory on that, right? So the entire point of so this is called there's an actual strategic term for this, which is hold on if I can remember correctly. Um, oh shoot, why am I forgetting this right now? This is very embarrassing, but I've mentioned it before. Essentially, you match or you place even pressure along the line. Um, and the one place that you actually want your attack to be successful, you put more resources onto that point. So you achieve local superiority of numbers. This
Economy of
strategy,
force.
what's that? No. It's not economy of force. Why can I never remember this terminology? Shoot. One second.
well, I think people have referred to this recently. I mean, this is part of the strategy that allowed it to take Ugladar. Is rather than focus in one particular area, the Russians kept hitting different parts of the front around Ugladar, so that the Ukrainians couldn't defend one particular point that the Russians were going for, but they kept switching their focus between different flanks until they were able to actually achieve the breakthrough, the local breakthrough they were looking for in order to outflank Ugladar.
Okay.
So
Yes,
maybe,
I have the term. Sorry.
yeah.
So
Well,
yeah, the Russians are making an attack. What's called an oblique order attack, basically. That's
okay.
the strategic term for it. Yes, it's famous because that's what Frederick the Great used at the Battle of Leuthen. But the Russians are basically doing the same thing, which is why they're attacking Chasiv Yar. They're just ensuring that is pressure on every section of the line, so that the Ukrainians are unable or will be unwilling to transfer any sort of reserves to other sections of the line where the Russians are actually placing the majority of their effort.
Okay, and yeah, I've heard that term before. Oblique order is just like, I don't know. Imagine like an ancient battle. You'd have, your center, your right flank, your left flank, and or I guess that would be your right flank, whatever. And you'd have, units deployed, right? And then they'd be facing the other army. And oblique order is just like you stack one side more than the other ones.
Right. It's just that the Russians are doing this in the center of their battle line strategically, and rather than on the right or the left flank. Right. So it's almost similar to a boar's head, a boar's snout attack, kind of, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. I don't want to go too long on the stream. What anything else we should cover? I mean, we could go much more detailed in the map, but I think we've kind of hit the point a lot that in this key battle space, there's just a gaping hole in the Ukrainian front, and that's really the takeaway here. Is that there's nothing else to say, but this has collapsed. This front line has collapsed. The Russians are advancing kilometers every day. By the end of the year, probably all of this will have fallen. The Russians will probably have advanced to here. They'll probably have advanced to the outskirts of is it
Andreevka.
Andreevka? What is this called? Yeah, Andreevka.
Andreevka.
So you can imagine, if the Russians, I'm saying the Russians are probably going to have like this territory under their control by like the end of the year. By the time Trump comes into office, they may well have taken Velika Novoselica and Andreevka as well. And it's then like, okay, so the front looks like this now. And once the front is here, I mean, there's just nothing stopping the Russians from this point from just going hard to the west, which I think, as we've talked about, is what they're trying to do. All of this going on in southern Donetsk right now, I think, is setting up for the attack on Zaporozhye. And I think we agree on that.
But do we have a winner for the cigar bet?
Right. Yeah, so I X-chat. I don't know if anyone commented, but who won the cigar bet? Was there a big arrow offensive?
At the beginning of the stream, didn't you ask me to arbitrate as a neutral?
I think you should arbitrate, yes. So let's wrap up the stream, I think, with this. So the bet was it was on December 31st of last year. Sorry, December 30th of last year. So let me go to the calendar and we will set the front to December 30th. Nope, I clicked today. I wish this was a little quicker. This is a nice feature, but it needs to be faster. December 30th, the front was like that. And then Mandrel said that there would be a big arrow offensive in the Donetsk Oblast, probably towards Pokrovsk. And the question is the outcome a big arrow offensive? So if we go to today, is that a big arrow offensive? Now, I guess it depends on what you consider a big arrow. I mean, you could say a big arrow has to be like on this scale, right? Because if we're looking at this scale, right, it's like the arrow would be like a little chode. Is that a big arrow offensive?
Funny is the word chode, because what I was actually going to say in my arbitration was that big arrow, not necessarily, but a fat arrow offensive, yes. Sorry,
it's definitely kind of a fat arrow, which a fat arrow is kind of a way you could. I mean, let's look at what he drew. Let's go back to what Mandrel drew on his doodle, which is this is a horrible doodle, man.
It's absolutely bad.
Like, I guess that kind of happened. I mean, that's Donetsk where the big arrows are coming from, right? And you lay it over Pokrovsk. And Ugladar is down here by this orange arrow, I believe, somewhere around there. Yes. So I guess, yeah, if we shorten these arrows a little bit, if we shorten those arrows a little bit, I can draw your arrows on the map, actually. So if we take your terrible drawing and we apply it here, it basically looks like this. This is kind of what you drew. And then, yeah, something like that. I mean, I would say that more or less happened, and then we can include this, right? I mean, as bonus. Like you didn't draw that, but
to the south.
Yeah, we cut off the tip. We circumcised that arrow, and we put it over here.
We redistributed the foreskin of the offensive.
Yeah. I don't know. I mean, here's the thing. It's like, I think in terms of defining what a big arrow is, in this phase of the war, we can't look at like the entire country. We have to look at the actual frontage. I think if we zoom in on Donetsk Oblast, given the pace of events, I think that, this is a big arrow considering the scale of the war at this time.
It's also been 11 months since the bet.
Yes.
That is true.
It's been a very long time in coming. It's not been quick.
It's been very slow. I mean, what do you think, Hunger? Because you're going to owe someone a cigar no matter what. Because either there was a big arrow and Mandrel wins, or there was not one and then I win. So who do you think won the bet?
Mandrel. Raging Mandrel got it. He gets a cigar.
I feel like I agree. I think I can argue that this is not a big arrow, but I feel kind of lame doing that. It just doesn't feel
ISR right. It's also ISR in the 21st century, so it's like, this is not Iraq 2003.
Mm-hmm.
Also, it's not exactly, I feel like it's not Belarusia 1941 either. So,
yeah. So I mean, is is this a big arrow? I don't know. I think in the spirit of the bet, I need to give Mandrill the cigar because
Total monkey victory.
It
yeah,
was
it just seems
mostly correct. Yeah.
and
If we
and
could,
look, you gave us a diagram that mostly happened. I think it's fair to give it to you.
if we could add another terminology into like the pantheon of military terminology, I just for the sake of a laugh, I just utilized a Google Translate, and I believe the word is umfang offensive, girth offensive. So there we go. May that enter lexicon from here on in.
Umfang offensive. Interesting.
Umfang offensive. Yeah.
Umfang.
Good German
And
word.
of course, yeah, I mean the Russians haven't taken it yet, but I mean the arrow's pretty fat. I mean, you could also draw like a, what's the wide Putin meme? It's like a
Monkey.
this is a super
wide
this is a
Putin monkey.
super wide arrow. It's a super wide arrow.
It's
Yeah, I
it's
mean,
a
that
short
pocket's
but
going to
thick.
collapse next week.
I can't even draw like an arrow that wide. Like
I love
It's,
I love
it's so,
how
it's so thick she can't even take it.
I love how this chat
There's the
has,
arrow.
or this conversation has been like 95% earnest, and then people who seriously care about the war will listen to like the last 10 minutes of this conversation and just realize that we're just making jokes about it.
Just four map autists
Oh, dear.
and their arrows.
It's a house.
Oh yes, make a nice little monkey house there. Good.
Yes. Yeah. So that's your chode house or whatever.
Well, at least we are the
So-
funniest Ukraine Donbass war channel.
At
Take that
least
to the
we
bank,
have-
guys.
At least we have a pimple in the banana of doom.
Yes.
Yeah, the banana of doom. That's funny. The front is like a banana. Like, yeah.
Mandrill and his Donbass banana.
Yes,
I guess-
give banana.
Quickly, we'll just say the Kursk offensive has been totally blown out. They only have this tiny foothold left. Really, just Suja.
No one
That's
cares.
gone. Bye. No one cares. It's over. How much territory did they have? They had like all of this or something, and now it's just like, yeah, you're done. Bye. So that failed. Yeah. So
Just before we actually end the stream, it's probably worth mentioning because we sort of didn't really touch on Kursk a lot, and I know like I will cop inevitable heat because I always make comparisons to past wars, but I'm sure between the four of us, when the offensive actually happened and during the course of it, there have been comparisons to like the Ardennes attack in sort of late '44 on the Western Front, and it definitely has that kind of feel to it that it's Ukraine throwing together the last of its precious reserves of men and material, thrown into sort of like this headlong attack, and to achieve what? I mean, a bit like when they threw the when they initiated Operation Vak am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. They did throw the best of their panzer forces. They did sort of scoop up the last of their sort of effective reserves of manpower and the last of their Luftwaffe essentially into that attack. And did it capture Antwerp? No. Did it separate British from American forces? No. Did it lead to some kind of separate peace with the Western Allies? No. What ended up happening was that the last of its military reserves and a great many of its newly built tanks were sort of left abandoned on the battlefield. And when the lines more or less returned to their old point somewhere in January 1945, the Germans were in a much worse position than what they were, in December, a month prior. And I kind of feel that Ukraine is in a sort of similar position now, maybe not so at the end of their strength, but I think it's the same kind of mindset of a headlong attack that really has no strategic sense. And I think has only worsened their prospects going forward. I mean, even really, if between us 4 weeks also we talked about the so-called summer offensive last year, and that was kind of almost another equivocal example of that being the case. When Ukraine was given that, it was lavishly sort of resupplied by the West and given all these new weapon systems, you would have imagined that Ukraine would have been of the mind to have engaged in some kind of disciplined but well thought out elastic defense of their most treasured territories and their most sort of necessary strong points, and instead they've executed to offensive of varying scale, but to achieve essentially nothing and have thrown away their best men and their best equipment for no gain. And I think we should keep that in mind as well, because I think both of these offensive actions will probably meet a similar fate in the end.
Yeah, I mean, we came out as saying the Kursk offensive makes no sense. I steel manned it. I think clearly it's been shown that yes, the Kursk offensive was a massive mistake. There's now a bleeding hole in Donetsk that cannot be plugged. If it could have been plugged, if they had the reserves to do so, they would have done so. The Ukrainian army is overstretched and it's in a state of collapse now. And I don't think the West can do anything about it. Even if Trump ramps up military aid to the max, there's simply not enough shells, and the goods can't be delivered fast enough. And yeah, there's not enough men unless the Ukrainians do full 18-year-old and up conscription, which could probably handle the issue for a few months, but the Ukrainian state would probably collapse pretty quickly after that. So anyway, here's the cigars. Yes, I guess you actually put 2 cigars up. So I guess I owe you. I guess I owe Mandrill the 2 H. Upman cigars. I'll have to acquire some or something similar.
Those are Cuban. Those are Cuban.
But are the cigars wider than they are longer? That's the question, Charlie.
Yeah. I don't know anything about cigars, so I can acquire for you 2 or a single cigar that
Diamond Crowns are pretty
you would
good.
like.
Yeah, you can get me a short, fat one. That's good for the Cho defensive,
Yes, that's actually fitting. So I guess I'll see you in like March or something.
I'll cut these in half.
Yes.
So yeah, it'll be. I have time to get a cigar, and yeah, you can cut those in half since it's a chode. Should we do another bet for the next year? That could be fun. Like, should we do one whether or not the war will end in 2025? Like, would that be a good bet? What are your takes on that? I think it won't.
I'm 0 for 2 in my political predictions, so I think I'll sit this one out.
One bet I would be willing to make personally is I think what might be a good call, because we don't actually quite know if the war's going to end. A lot really depends on the attitude that prevails in Moscow and the attitude that prevails in Washington. But in terms of strategy, if the war in fact isn't brought to a relatively swift halt, is because we see where the sort of battle lines are roughly shaping up and how the strategic aims are sort of gradually being satisfied by the Russians, and they're sort of them achieving short-term and medium-term military objectives. Will the Russian army, and I mean, I suppose technically in Kherson region they are at the Dnieper and they have been there since the beginning almost, but will they reach, say, Zaporozhye and or Dnipro by year's end? Will they basically close the distance and sort of take the entirety of the Donbass and reach that eastern bank of the Dnieper? That might be a worthwhile bet, possibly, from a strategic standpoint.
Yeah, I think absolutely no way. Do you have a differing opinion on that?
I mean, I'm bound to think that. I mean, I thought they would have got there. I think I predicted this like back in early 2023, so I'm probably like a year and a half out of my prediction. But I think the Russians will get there on the proviso that the war actually continues, of course. Whether they take the cities in time, I'm not sure, but I think they'll definitely reach them by the end of 2025, assuming the war continues.
Okay. Yeah, I would be willing to bet against that. What do you think, Mandrill?
I don't know. I sluggish pace right now. I'm not exactly sure I'd be willing to side with Furious on that. I don't think that the Russians will reach the Dnipro at all by 2025. I think maybe 2026. If we're assuming that you have to basically assume that the Ukrainian army is collapsing by that point, and I'm not seeing a huge amount of indication. I think they have another year or so.
Yeah, we've seen a localized collapse, but it's not even as bad as the Russian collapse in September 2022 in Lugansk that we talked about. But it could very quickly become that bad. It's the early stages. The bet, Hunger, is that the proposed bet is that the Russians will reach Dnipro and Zaporozhye or Zaporozhye by the end of 2025. Furious says they will. I say they won't. Mandrill says they won't. That's the proposition. I say we wait until December 30th, as your bet was last time, to actually come up with something we want to put some more cigars on the line for, just for fun again.
Yeah, I would agree with waiting, because if there is a collapse and it begins escalating beyond a localized, we'll probably see that within the next month. So,
or if, for instance, like Trump takes power, what is it, Jan 7 or Jan 10, whenever it is, and then like within a month the war ends, then we sort of all have egg on our faces.
That's why we have to do it before. We have to do it in December 30th, before he comes in the office, to make it more interesting.
Exactly.
Also, we have 2 months. We have 2 months until Trump is president, so Russia could do a lot in 2 months.
Yes, I mean, I think they're going to. I think they're really going to put a lot of pressure in southern Donetsk over the next 2 months, and that's why I'm fairly confident they're going to pretty much move their line up to Pokrovsk and prepare to do that cauldron maneuver in 2026. I don't see any reason to think the rate of advance is going to slow down. It's going to speed up, and I think they're going to put extra pressure to speed it up as much as possible before Trump gets into office. The thing is, if the Ukrainians are kind of obviously being routed, on a 50 to 100 mile frontage by the time Trump comes into office, the argument for, not giving the Russians basically what they're asking for is pretty difficult to make. It's like when you've defeated the enemy army, it's like how do you get to impose terms as the proxy for the defeated army? But anyway, we're just past the 2 hour mark, so I think it's time to wrap up. I will shill the Old Glory Club one more time before we close the stream out. I will present the website again, and I will also bring up our YouTube channel. I think that will show up. No, I'm only sharing the one tab. So, here's our website, theoldgloryclub.com. It has a bunch of links there. The Old Glory Club is a fraternal society and a mutual aid society that many Americans are joining in their respective states or cities, or however localized the chapters are. We have a list of our current chapters on the website. There are actually more that are listed here. This will be updated shortly to reflect the current chapters that we have in existence. And if you're curious about joining a chapter of like-minded individuals, you can email us, as is noted on the website. Our YouTube channel, where we do most of where I do most of my streaming now, is also on the website. But you can also, I'll show it real quick. You can subscribe to this YouTube channel. We do live streams once a week. The Pony Express Radio, I'm on most of them. As you can see, we've got quite a substantial back catalog here. And we have a Substack as well, which has 3 articles a week published on it, 2 free and 1 paid on Friday. Here's the Substack, most recent article right here. We have a lot of guest submissions, actually, so some of the articles are written by me and other people who run the Old Glory Club. Others are user submitted. Our website explains how you can do that. We like our user submissions. We like giving new perspectives from our people. And the criteria, I'll just share really quickly. If you have an article you'd like to write, is over 800 words, and it has to be pro-America. We are a pro-America organization. That's what we are for. We are for the good of heritage Americans, both locally and in the entire country. So please check that out. Subscribe, join a chapter, email us. It's growing a lot. This is where I am doing most of my streaming and and writing now. If you are subscribed to this channel and you are not aware of that. So that's it for my shilling of the OGC. Anyone else? Mandrel, I guess. Mandrel, of course, is a member of the Old Glory Club, also one of the co-founders of the Old Glory Club. So aside from that, do you have anything you want to show?
Yeah, go check out Hitman's channel as well. I was on his channel yesterday discussing the BBC series from the 1970s called The First Churchills, which is kind of a relevant discussion, given that we've had some Churchill talk over the last several months.
Yes, I did see that stream come up in my feed. I like Hitman's channel, so I will check that out. Let's see. How do we find Hitman on YouTube? I'll pull up his channel so people know what to look for. Because if you just search Hitman on YouTube, I doubt you're going to find what you're looking for. Fairly
Hitman
small channel.
9801.
Yes, there he is, Hitman 9801. He's very. It's a very apostolic majesty style channel, which I would imagine he would take as a great compliment. I've been on once to talk about the Suez Crisis. Really good channel if you like that sort of deep dive history content.
We've all been on
this
this channel.
Correct. I think we've all been on at least once, haven't we?
I was
Yes.
just on Saturday.
Yes.
Nice.
Yeah, we've all done little stints here. Yeah, nice little channel. He does very good work. He's very thorough in his research. Avid reader. Definitely worth anyone's while.
Yeah. So, Hunger, did you just chill, or is it Marcus's turn?
Other than watching Hitman stream, highly recommend. Twitter, X. I'll never call it X. It's just Twitter at HungerDye DYE, and I am a member of the Old Glory Club, and that's it.
Very good. And Marcus, you're not eligible for the Old Glory Club being Australian, but we still love our Australian brothers, fellow Anglo-Saxon pioneers.
OGC adjacent.
What do you have to shill? Anything?
Well, I did shield the start of the stream, but I shall reiterate that myself and Mr. Apostolic Majesty have been sort of semi-active once again. Did stream last week Charles XII and the Great Northern War, Kingdom of Sweden, and their Great Power era. And in a day or two's time, we shall be streaming. Actually, probably this time tomorrow, thereabouts. We will stream about the dismantling and destruction of Prussia, and the sort of the post-war, exactly, Prussia, the execution of a nation. We will canvass that in a couple of days' time, and it's wonderful to be back with Mr. Majesty. As you guys know, I have done an awful lot of work with him, and he's really the mainstay of history in our circles, and AM does excellent content, and probably one of the most well-read people I know. And like, for me to say that's a big deal. And it's a joy to work with him. We've been at it nearly 3 years, I think. So it's good to be sort of semi back at it with doing streams with him. And actually, that being said, I was on with AA last week as well. We spoke about farming, and that was just in the lead up to the actual farmers' protest that occurred a day or two ago in London. So there's been a bit to talk about, and indeed, I can only recommend, I can only reiterate too, these lovely gents have mentioned the Old Glory Club, and as an Australian, obviously cannot be part of that, but they do excellent stuff, and if you're an American, I very much urge you and encourage you to follow Old Glory Club and to get involved to whatever manner you can, and to follow these three wonderful gents here. Thank you very much, Charlie. It's good to be back.
Excellent. Yeah, I was glad to have you on. So, yes, I will do the baton pass. Mr. Burden, the coal poster in chief, is live with Aggie Platypus right now. You can go check that out.
I remember that.
I will pop right over there. And yeah, this should be very good. So, thanks for coming on, everybody. And we'll probably do another one of these after we hear something from Trump after the inauguration.
Yeah.
So thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
Good idea. Cheers, guys.
Good night.